one size does not fit all. Contemporary practice, therefore, does not favor any single project design or particular form of land tenure as the outcome. Instead, most projects now apply a holistic approach. This approach has been described in the 2007 UN Habitat publication, How to Develop a Pro-Poor Land Policy. And it's been detailed in much of the literature since 2007. The approach can be summarized with 5 guiding principles. First, each proposed intervention should start with a diagnosis of all of the factors in the system that must interact to deliver land to the market for housing and for investment. In order to get accurate data and insight, there must be a high level of public involvement, which often can be achieved by involving a well-organized local NGO. Citizens should be engaged at all stages. There should be very sensitive communication. And when public education and public participation events are held, they should follow formats that are quite comfortable and familiar to the local population. The UN Habitat Global Land Tool Network, that's GLTN, their publication Count Me In describes many effective techniques of community organizing and participation. A second guideline that we can draw from the experience is that the organization of information about the forms of land tenure and the measurement of their strengths and weaknesses can be done using the analytic tool called the Continuum of Land Rights. This tool has been developed by the GLTN and the World Bank. On the slide you can see the initial model of that continuum. The continuum has been refined by USAID for application to urban landholding. And in practice, the continuum is created by a city or a zone census in which the households and landholders are asked to describe or to show their documents of tenure. The numbers of people holding each form of tenure are calculated and they're geographically distributed by block or by subzone. Then the continuum chart is prepared. It shows the tenure forms from the weakest to the strongest. This then reveals the situation. Are most people in the weakest categories, or are they at mid-level? Are people with certain types of tenure concentrated in certain subzones? Or are people with different kinds of tenure mixed together on the same blocks or in the same areas? Do the predominant forms of tenure appear to give adequate de facto security? Continuum helps us to ask and answer these questions. Third stage, a parallel diagnosis should be made of the public and the private institutions that control planning and development and that finance and construct new housing. Again, a series of questions should be asked. Do the costs and complexities of planning and regulation push up the price of serviced land to a level where it's not affordable for most of the population? Are there competitive private enterprises and financial institutions involved in development and land delivery? Or are there government agencies, quasi-government entities, or various forms of public-private arrangements that in fact control development and control the delivery of land for housing? Do these enterprises and agencies function transparently? Do they use regular business dealings? For this analysis, the Land Government Assessment Framework, what we call the LGAF, has been formulated by the UN Food and Agriculture, and it's been adapted for urban use by UN Habitat and the World Bank. The LGAF describes 21 indicators in 5 categories of administration, land management, business dealings, and mediation that can be chosen to structure the information about local conditions and to measure it against international standards. Fourth idea of guidance. Particular attention should be paid to the role of women and to the ways in which vulnerable groups, that is children, widows, and the disabled, can be protected in land dealings. Most countries now have legislation that follows the main principles of gender equality and property rights in marriage and in inheritance. However, women continue to encounter obstacles in practice. Therefore, projects now incorporate specific methods to educate and engage women. One interesting experiment has been conducted recently in Tanzania, where a lower registration fee is charged by the registry office when both husband and wife sign the title documents. This gives an incentive for a joint title to be created. A fifth item of guidance. The focus should be on providing the largest number of landholders with just enough security to achieve their goals. This can spare the project the very high costs of precise surveying and detailed verification of proofs of right. More importantly, it can allow the local government to continue the work after international funding has ended. Further, it may help avoid the problem that titling will enable landholders to profit from rising property values while causing their tenants to face higher rents and displacement. Several recent projects have assisted tenants specifically by providing standard ground leases or building leases, housing tenancy agreements, and by providing a convenient local registry of these rights, or by providing mediation or a paralegal service to ensure enforcement and the mediation of disputes. In other projects, the benefited landholders receive conditional land ownership titles, or they have been made members of a collective or a cooperative title. These kind of mechanisms that are conditioned can ensure that the landholders are not able to quickly sell out to land speculators, and they can ensure that rents do not raise inordinately on the tenants who are in place. Cities in Brazil, in Peru, in Argentina have experimented with various types of social protection forms of tenure. Recently, Tanzania and South Africa have used collective titles in some projects. Finally, it's been recognized that the holistic approach generates multivariable data which may not fit the standard GIS rule of one property right to one unit of property. This has meant that the typical cadastre map and the land rights registry are inadequate to organize the data. They may be unable to record and maintain rights which apply only partially to land, which overlap on more than one unit, or which contain varying content or varying time periods. Thus, several institutions, including GLTN and the International Federation of Surveyors, that's FIG, these organizations now promote an open source data and mapping system called the Social Domain Tenure Model. It permits more types of rights and varied forms of proof of tenure to be kept and managed in an efficient system. So now let's look at an example of the holistic approach. Turn to Brazil, where several recent projects have used a mechanism which is called a special zone of social interest. That's ZEIS in its Portuguese form. This special zone has been authorized in a national law called the Statute of Cities of 2001. Before that date, Brazil had experience over several decades in carrying out projects of slum rehabilitation. They've included the expansion of infrastructure and public services into the favelas and the barrios of São Paulo, of Rio, of Recife, and other cities. In many of these projects, there was an accompanying rearrangement of land holdings and the issuance of titles or of stronger leases or occupancy permits to the landholders. Many of these projects, however, encountered obstacles and encountered very high costs as a result of the elaborate and expensive regulatory standards for construction and infrastructure. Further, in many of the zones, once the new titles, land rights were put into place, families and landholders quickly sold out to speculators. Prices rose, pushing up rents, and tenants were displaced. The displaced households, in many cases, moved to new slums in other parts of the city, and the cycle of informality and the need for rehabilitation began once again. In order to remedy these problems, the ZEIS now allows the slum rehabilitation projects to incorporate two new mechanisms. First, the city is allowed to negotiate with the community, with the landholders, and with developers to set specifically tailored rules and regulations for construction, for width of streets, for height and design of buildings, and for the hookup of various infrastructure systems. For example, narrow streets may be allowed in order to minimize the removal of buildings. Similarly, the rules of development relating to density, to building heights, and to placement of projects on land can also be adjusted in order to allow some parcels or blocks to be redeveloped with new market rate development, while other blocks are preserved with lower income housing and with smaller scale development. The value gain in the areas with new development provides a cross-subsidy for the low-income housing or for the fund that pays for the infrastructure to upgrade the zone. A second new mechanism that the ZEIS allows are forms of conditional tenure and collective or community titles. The conditional ownership forms impose on an owner a limitation on the rents that he or she can charge to the tenants. In other cases, a limitation can be put on a household that receives a title from selling that parcel for a period of 5 or 10 years. Alternatively, a collective title may be created that places the ownership right in a community group. The whole block of landholders can be included in the collective with undivided shares of the title right. They may hold leases or specific occupancy permits to their individual units. If they need to move away, they must either receive permission from the collective to sell their shares, or they must sell back to the community itself. This allows the sales price, in effect, to be split with the collective, so that a part of the value gain in the land and the property can be kept and used either as a subsidy for low-income housing or to continue the improvements of infrastructure in the zone. The ZEIS projects remain experimental, but their initial legitimacy and their success seems to rest on 3 factors. First, Brazil in its laws and in its constitution has had a long tradition of the idea of a social function of property. Second, the national government has taken a strong interest and participation in the projects. And finally, in most of the cities that have used the ZEIS, the resulting growth in property values has in fact made the limitations of shared profits and rent limitations more easy for landholders to bear.